Hey, small group leaders, this is your October small group leader training. Let me first say thank you so much for leading your small groups. I couldn't be more proud of you guys, and I couldn't be more blessed to be a part of a ministry that's changing so many lives, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some lessons on leadership from Jesus in Mark chapter 5. Now, Mark chapter 5 is a phenomenal story. You got the father with the 12-year-old daughter who's deathly ill, and Jesus is on an emergency case traveling to that house to help rescue someone in need. And along the way, the press of the crowd is so thick, they're bumping into him and rubbing shoulders, and there's just so many, it's like Jesus at Disneyland. There's so many people there. And in the midst of it all, there's a woman who's had an issue of blood for 12 years. And it even says she's been misused and mistreated by doctors who had no cure for her. In fact, now she's penniless and worse off for their intervention. She would be unclean, so unwelcome in this crowd of people or in polite society. She would have had to announce her uncleanness wherever she went, and therefore probably would not have been around a crowd like this, except for this. She'd heard about Jesus. Do you remember when you heard about Jesus? And you knew you just needed to get close to him. And that's what was happening in her heart. So she works her way through the press of the crowd, all the people bumping and jostling into Jesus because he's drawn quite a crowd. And she just reaches out to touch the hem of his garment. And in so doing, she knows she's healed. She can feel the healing go through her. And Jesus feels the virtue leave him. And he stops the crowd and he asks, "Who's touched me?" And his disciples, those closest to him, go, "Jesus, how could you even ask a question like that? There's so many people here. There's probably dozens of people who have touched you." But what we learn here is that there's a difference between touching Jesus and touching Jesus. You see, a lot of people that day probably brushed shoulders with him, probably had some type of contact with him. But the way in which this woman approached Jesus was different. And he insists on knowing who touched me. And that's our leadership lesson. You see, his intent was not to embarrass, although it would have been difficult for this woman. His intent was not to bring glory to himself. His intent in this, in insisting on who touched me, in asking that that person be identified, was this, is he wanted to point out that there's a difference between what is common and what is done in faith. And that's what he wanted to celebrate in front of everybody. And that's what we need to celebrate as small group leaders. And that's my question for you for this month. Who in your group is touching Jesus? Who's pressing towards them in a fresh wave of faith, in a renewed sense of need for him, and really seeing God move out and touch them and move powerfully in their situation and their life? And are we doing that in such a way that it celebrates that, it honors that, because that's what Jesus did, in such a way that it would have inspired the entire crowd to not just brush shoulders with Jesus, not just be in the same vicinity with Jesus, but to have the kind of faith that when it touched just the hem of his garment, the miraculous happened. Who's that happening for you in your group? And how are you celebrating that as a group? That's what I want you to respond to me with by email, danf@livingfaithfellowship.com. Just share that. How are you celebrating it, and who's doing it? And if someone's not doing it, then answer this question. How are you cultivating that kind of expectancy for touching Jesus in your group? Send that to me by the end of this month. I can't wait to read them, and we'll move into next month strong. God bless you guys as you lead your group. I pray the anointing of Jesus to come over you as we follow his lessons on leadership. See you next month.